There is nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. That was Ernest Hemingway on writing. I'm no Hemingway, of whom, incidentally, V.S. Naipaul said he was so busy being an American, and that he didn't know how to compose a paragraph. As a 4 decades long practitioner of this rather devalued craft and thinking of writing and composing paragraphs, these days I'm in the midst of writing 4 books at once. One of those is an early construction of my memoir titled Tangential Life. It's really an apt title since I've led a tangential life both professionally and personally. I mean, more in a geometric sense when I say tangential, because as a journalist, I've almost entirely been a tangent to the many people I've come into contact with: politicians, scientists, painters, musicians, gangsters, insurgents, singers, movie stars. Speaking of movie stars, today happens to be the 83rd birth anniversary of Shashi Kapoor. Let me quickly get this trivial observation out of the way at the outset. Shashi Kapoor had the most luxuriant eyelashes in Hindi cinema. I can prove it visually if so required. Now that that has been settled, on to my only interview with the suave and personable movie star and producer. Cutting a dashing figure in a 3-piece pinstripe suit, Shashi Kapoor stood in the large porch of a famous bungalow in then Bombay's Juhu area. His right hand was in the pocket of his pleated trousers and his left dangling from a lower pocket of his fully buttoned up vest. The only detail missing was a retinue of obsequious servants. In the city's polyester humidity, Kapoor did not seem to break into a sweat. As I alighted from a taxi outside the iron gate of the bungalow named Radhika, he appeared to sense that I was the journalist he had given an appointment to that morning. As I climbed up the few steps, he stretched out his hand and said, "I'm Shashi Kapoor, I'm an actor." "Mein cha" is all I said. That I was a journalist was implicit. I knew about Kapoor's habit of always introducing himself by name, but the way he did it with me came across as mildly amusing and somewhat of mischievous humility. I was amused, especially by the part "I'm an actor." Later, he wove that reference into a context while talking about his much written about insanely busy career as an actor. He shot continuously in 3 shifts those days, prompting his more illustrious eldest brother Raj Kapoor to somewhat chidingly describe him as a taxi, as in someone who plied the roads, being hailed by anyone and everyone as long as they paid. He had seen me get out of that taxi earlier, and this is what he says: "Raj ji, mujhe aajkal taxi kehte hain." I'm, of course, an actor, he said. By the time I met Shashi Kapoor in 1986, and the only time I met him, Kapoor was one of Hindi cinema's biggest stars, but wore his success rather lightly, and sometimes even dismissively. He looked a tad older than his 48 because he had become somewhat neglectful of his own health after the death in 1984 of his wife Jennifer, whom he doted on. Without being prompted by me, he pointed at his portly bearing and said, "This is not for a role. Jennifer would not have let me become so fat." He joked that his body worked for that particular role because he was playing a wealthy businessman in a movie whose name he did not seem to remember, neither did he care to remember. "I'm an actor who does what is expected of him by the director," he said. Without the famous last name, Kapoor might have remained just a trophy star leveraging his exceptionally good looks. But he came from Hindi cinema's most illustrious family, where his father Prithviraj and brothers Raj and Shammi had been among the biggest names. He drew upon his considerable talents to give some truly memorable performances. I remember having observed that his eyelashes were so lush that he could lend some of that to his fellow actresses without noticing the difference. He guffawed. He said he had inherited his father's features, father being, of course, the great Prithviraj Kapoor. Shashi Kapoor, in fact, frequently looked like a spitting image of Prithviraj Kapoor. From what I remember the most of that interaction was a star untouched by the trimmings of his success. Being the youngest of the three Kapoor brothers, Shashi had seen glamour for such a long time, his whole life really, that its lures and deceptions had no effect on him. That unself-conscious attitude mixed with his extraordinary good looks and charms made him even more likable than he might have been otherwise. One of the questions that I remember was about how he managed to juggle so many assignments without messing up the details of a particular character. I was taken aback by his candor when he countered, "What details? You just create them as you go along." Lest anyone underestimate his craft, it was the response of someone who had been at it from his childhood and had, in fact, internalized the process. At the same time, he was quite humorously self-aware of how much of his work in the 1980s was eminently forgettable. This is what he said to me: "I need money to make my own more credible movies. It's a good balance. I respect this work and that." Although Kapoor's career was full of instances of his impressive acting chops, he never really projected himself as a brooding, serious artist. He knew that acting was predominantly about being in the moment and not necessarily a doctoral dissertation. I spent about 2 hours on the set of the movie he was shooting that day and whose name he appeared not to remember. I watched him give perfect single takes with rather involved lines and emotions. During one of his many returns from these takes, he remarked that that ease of remembering his lines came from having seen his father Prithviraj do so on stage. Performances were always in the Kapoor ecology, and for Shashi Kapoor, being the youngest of the three brothers, was particularly so. That was one main reason why he never seemed like a labored, rehearsed performer. All stars the world over come to be distilled into a few memorable scenes. For him, it was, of course, the 1979 hit Diwar, where he was paired with Amitabh Bachchan and with whom he did more than a dozen movies. The scene and the lines are so iconic for Hindi cinema audiences around the world that they need no introduction. For me, it would be enough to say "Mere paas maa hai." The measured, succinct tone with which Kapoor, playing a morally upright police officer, delivered that one line in response to a rather grandiose boast by his wayward smuggler brother Bachchan remains one of Hindi cinema's most defining moments. Even though "Mere paas maa hai" has now become a cinematic cliché in India, it is now a great example of a no-fuss actor-star delivering from the gut of his lifelong exposure to the craft. I surprised Shashi Kapoor by deliberately not asking about that line. "You've said and done it, there is nothing more to dwell on," I said. On that note, we shook hands. That was more than 3 decades ago. I never met him after that. Here is to Shashi Kapoor.